So now we are recording, and I'm going to share the slides with you if I can find them on here. Yeah, here we go. Yes, here we are. I'm going to get rid of my picture because I don't want to look at me, and go from the current slide. Okay, we're going to work. Yes, thank you. On to the work of someone that I've mentioned before, who is one of 3 female economists who I look up to so much. There's not a deliberate gender bias here or anything. I just think these 3 economists, for me, are the most important economists in the world. And if other people don't think with me, well, fair enough, they don't have to. But Stephanie, you know about Mariana, I've mentioned, at least briefly. Well, a couple of times we've mentioned Mariana. Now we're talking about Kate Raworth. It was one of my proudest days on Twitter when Kate Raworth started following me, as well as me following her, which means occasionally I'm able to ask her the odd question now, which I couldn't do before, which is terrific. Her book is terrific, and many of you, if not all of you by now, are aware that Kate thinks that in the 21st century we need to move away from targeting the growth in GDP, at least for its own sake, and instead have an approach to managing our economies at the global level, at the national level, the regional level, and at the level of the city too, which relies instead on a set of indicators. And these indicators should be selected, and Kate has suggested some based on the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, to ensure that everybody has the means of living a good life, a good and secure and engaged life. That's what she means when she talks about social foundations. And of course, to allow us to live a good life, we have to use some of the Earth's resources, and we have to generate some waste. You know, we can't stop creating waste. Every time you go to the toilet, you're creating waste. You create waste in all sorts of ways as a result just of living on the planet. We have to meet our needs, but we have to live within our planetary boundaries, within what's called the ecological ceiling here. We have to obey those 3 precepts for sustainability, which were laid down by Kate Raworth's, I might say, icon or inspiration, who we've mentioned before, Herman Daly. We have to locate ourselves in the future in that safe and just space for humanity, creating what Kate calls a regenerative and distributive economy. Unfortunately, we still live in a world, and even in Australia, we live in a country where there is a shortfall for some people, for some of the social foundations of living a good and secure life, while at the same time, we are well outside our ecological ceiling, as we know. The ecological ceiling was made more explicit a little bit more than 10 years ago by Johan Rockstrom with Will Steffen, who we've mentioned before, and who I've just shared a TED talk from 2010 from on our site at the Stockholm Resilience Centre, where they identified 9 planetary boundaries which we should be very careful to avoid going beyond if we want to have a sustainable environment for future generations to live on. And the 9 pretty obvious. Most of course, climate change is there. There were at least two, I think maybe even three, but there are two listed on here, where at the time the data was not sufficiently understood and quantified for us to be able to specify what that boundary is exactly, but we know it's there, and I think that's still true. Well, in 2009, the climate crisis was already obviously an impending crisis, but otherwise, the two boundaries at the time, which we had clearly gone far beyond, was the putting excess nitrogen in the soil, which creates all sorts of problems that you can look at online, but one very obvious one is that it ends up poisoning the fish and promoting the development of algal blooms in watercourses. And there was a news story just the other day about 200 elephants in Thailand dying as a result of drinking from water which had been poisoned by algal blooms, which had been promoted in their development partly by climate factors, but also partly as a result of nitrogen fertilizer being put into the soil and runoff. And biodiversity loss was obviously critical even then. There are ridiculous statistics here. We are told that I'm coming up for my 58th birthday. We're told that 70% of the world's wildlife has disappeared in my lifetime. Imagine that. Well over 90% of the biomass of vertebrates on Earth now is either us or species that we have domesticated. We can't do these kind of things without there being severe consequences which we don't understand at the moment. Risks of things like more pandemics coming around. Well, there's Johan Brockström discussing the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Of course, that was more than 10 years ago. If we fast forward to more or less now, then it's at a global level, we are not fully meeting any of those metrics of the social foundations of a good life for everybody, which Kate and others have identified. I won't go through them all now. You might not have the same list as Sarah, or you might not see them all as equally important. Anyway, it's the general idea that counts. But we are not only still obviously critically suffering from loss of biodiversity around the world. Extinctions are at anything up to 1,000 times their normal background level in the history of the Earth right now. So we are living through a mass extinction event. It's just this is the first one to be caused by human beings right now. But both nitrogen and phosphorus loading, they're critically a problem. The land conversion issue, particularly deforestation, which of course is related to these other things, is a major problem. And climate change is getting to the point where it is, well, it's long been an emergency, but where everybody should be aware by now that it's an emergency. So we urgently, and scientists that I respect say, forget 2050, we should be thinking about the 2030s. We urgently need to come back within that ecological ceiling if you want to have much of a planet left to pass on to your grandchildren and great grandchildren, if that's something that you care about, depending on how you discount the well-being of future generations. But of course, we're seeing some of the consequences of what our activities are doing to the world even now. I think that in another 5 to 10 years, if you do an economics degree somewhere like the University of Adelaide, this slide or something like it will be at the beginning of the first class in economic principles. That's the kind of shift in mindset which I think we are on the brink of going through, being forced to go through globally. We're not there yet, obviously. All right, well, I'm not going to go through this. You can read through this cartoon for yourself. It is about the science of climate change. The points that I would draw to your attention. This has been understood broadly in the scientific community since 1896. And there have been clear data that we are facing an impending climate emergency since 1986, I think it is. When James Hansen told a Senate committee about what lay ahead and about what human activities were doing to the climate system, the greenhouse effect, as it was called at the time. And indeed, the first report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was not long delayed. It came out in 1990. If governments around the world had acted on that first report in the 1990s, we would not be in the pickle that we are now. We have waited 30 years and done almost nothing so far in order to meet this challenge. We don't have another 30 years. There's so many charts, so much data. Blow up that cover of Time magazine and have a look at it for yourself. What have we got at the top here? And Will Stephen's talk I've just shared goes back millions of years, not thousands of years, but we've got thousands of years of data on carbon dioxide, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And you can see that going back, actually you go back much further than 800,000 years, but over the last 800,000 years, no stage before 1950 had the carbon dioxide concentration in our atmosphere been above 300 parts per million. Now, it used to be said by climate scientists that the safe concentration of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere was 350 parts per million. There is an organization which campaigns on climate change, which uses that 350, calls itself 350. They now say that a concentration of perhaps 450 parts per million might be consistent with global warming of between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, and that might not trigger tipping points towards a hot house Earth, might not be catastrophic. Well, it's just as well they don't talk about 350 anymore, because we're up to above 410 now, as you can see from the chart, and carbon dioxide concentration is going to keep rising. It's rising at about 2 parts per million a year at the moment. And once you add on what they call other forcing factors, other greenhouse gases that are less long-lived than carbon dioxide, like methane, which has a very powerful effect, then we're up to that 450 already, effectively. And there's lots of data that you can show, linking, and of course, it doesn't on its own tell you about cause and effect, but the scientists can tell us about that. They understand the science of how carbon dioxide in the atmosphere drives climate change. And you can just track the growing concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to increases in the average global temperature over time. And it's pretty clear, really. In science, you will never, ever, ever get all scientists to say, or even most of them to say, they're 100% certain about something. But we are as close to 100% certain about this as anybody can ever be about any scientific proposition. It would be extraordinary now if the science of climate change and the projections of natural scientists, climate scientists about what lies ahead were entirely wrong. And indeed, the more evidence that they get, the more it looks as though they've been excessively on the conservative side. And of course, their language is always on the conservative side too, because that's the way that scientists generally are. They don't make statements that they're not very, very confident about. So the question is if there's too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere already, if we want to stop that concentration going up too much further, because we don't want a even more dangerous a degree of climate change than we've already brought about, well, we have to understand the relationship between stocks and flows here. The concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is a stock. Our emissions each year are a flow. And while we are making net emissions of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as a result of human activities, upsetting the natural natural balance between the Earth's processes that emit carbon dioxide and absorb carbon dioxide. It's not about just reducing our level of emissions. Our net emissions have to come to zero in order to stop pushing climate change further. Well, the question then is this consistent with continuing to grow gross domestic product? Or indeed, as the degrowth people say, do we need to shrink global gross domestic product in order to bring this about? We're going back to the idea of decoupling again, but now in a narrower sense. We're just talking about the climate and carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases for the moment. Well, globally, we have enjoyed relative decoupling for a long time now, in the sense that growth in global gross domestic product, sometimes called gross world product, has not been matched by an equiproportionate growth in our emissions of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide emissions have been growing, but not as quickly as the world economy. There has been relative decoupling. That's not, by the way, been because we've got all that far as a world with renewable energy or anything. It's because the energy intensity of gross domestic product has fallen, partly as global output has shifted from manufacturing to services, but also because of technological changes as well. We're basically more energy efficient than we used to be. But globally, we have relative decoupling. In Australia, we have relative decoupling in that our emissions, although electricity emissions fell for a while there was an emissions trading scheme in place, our emissions are definitely rising, or at least were last year. They won't do this year because of the recession. There are a small number of high-income countries that have managed some absolute decoupling, very moderate absolute decoupling, including particularly countries in the European Union. But there is no country at the moment that is showing signs of sufficient absolute decoupling, so that within the next couple of decades, they'll be in a position where there's a zero net emissions. There are a lot of governments talking about zero net emissions by 2050, but it's extremely doubtful that those countries will actually manage to achieve the goal that they've set for themselves. And of course, in Australia, we've not even set that goal for ourselves at all. The government refuses to commit even to that long-term target. And beyond that, bearing in mind the differences in the level of economic development, or GDP per capita, you can say if you like, in different countries around the world. If we thought that the world needed to be at zero net emissions by the 2050s, which is what the scientists tell us, subject to all sorts of optimistic assumptions about technologies relating to geoengineering and to carbon sequestration in the future, which may or may not be borne out by what actually happens. In other words, they're being on the super optimistic side. That actually means that rich countries should be going towards zero net emissions in the 2030s sometime, and there's no prospect of that at all. So it sometimes makes you think about stuff like you can see on the left-hand side here, particularly when you see people talking about how important fossil fuels are to countries like Australia, where we're, of course, amongst the world's biggest exporters of fossil fuels right now. If you've unmuted yourself, please mute yourself again. There's the evidence of global relative decoupling, just to show you that I'm not making it up. We've got gross world product rising over time. We've got carbon dioxide emissions rising. Have we made any progress? Well, when was the record year for carbon dioxide emissions as a result of human activities? Last year. That's the progress that we've made. And there's a statement from the CSIRO over on the left-hand side there. The central aim of the Paris Climate Agreement is to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius and pursue efforts to keep it below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Respected climate scientists like Kevin Anderson, who have been involved in the IPCC in the past, will tell you that there are all sorts, as I was just mentioning, of optimistic assumptions behind the Paris Climate Agreement, and targets were set there. To achieve this, anyway, global carbon dioxide emissions must decline by 3% and 7% each year. 3% and 7%, depending on whether you're talking about 1.5 and 2 degrees each year, respectively, until 2030, according to the United Nations Emissions Gap Report. Now, that'll happen this year, like it happened after the global financial crisis. But there is no reason at the moment to suppose that once we get past this pandemic recession, emissions won't start rising again. Because many countries, including Australia, once you strip out some cheating as far as accounting is concerned, which we won't worry about now, are not going to do anything like meet the commitments that they made at Paris. Another chart, basically talking about relative decoupling. I've already told you that it's not to do with renewables, it's to do with us using less energy per dollar of output. Well, you can see we've got our carbon dioxide per dollar of output falling, relative decoupling, but we've got the emissions of carbon dioxide globally, we've got them continuing to rise over time. There's all sorts of data. I could go back to the Global Footprint Network, which wasn't talking just about climate change, but about ecological limits in general. And they estimate, you know, I said last year it was 1.7 Earths, this year it's 1.6 Earths. They basically use that to say, well, how much of the year has gone by before we've used up our global biocapacity for the year, and we're eating into our natural capital and potentially into the well-being of future generations. Well, the trouble is that Earth Overshoot Day is going earlier and earlier and earlier each year. The reason why it's gone in the other direction this year is just we're not producing as much because of the global recession. This is important. Again, just to confirm what I was saying, if you decompose emissions growth, which is what the Global Carbon Project has done coming up to last year, what you can see is our carbon dioxide emissions per unit of primary energy, they are falling a bit, or they have been falling a bit as a result of the growing use of renewables in recent years, but we haven't gone very far with that so far. And instead, it's the energy intensity of GDP. As I said, some of that's technology, a lot of it is a shift to services over time. You can see as energy use has gone up, well, so carbon dioxide emissions in line. And here is a quote from the IPCC. Human activities are estimated to have caused approximately 1 degree Celsius of global warming above pre-industrial levels, with a likely range of 0.8 to 1.2 already. That's your 95% confidence interval. global warming is likely to reach 1.5 Celsius between 2030 and 2052 if it continues to increase at the current rate. There are reasons to believe, to do with the El Nino effect and some other factors, that we might temporarily go above 1.5 degrees Celsius even before 2030. I talked about decoupling. We have seen globally that there has been relative decoupling, but not absolute decoupling. Well, there is some good news. There has been some mild absolute decoupling, as we can see here in recent years in the European Union and in the USA. The difference between the segmented line and the unsegmented line is that the unsegmented line relates to production, the segmented line relates to consumption. Once you take consumption into account in the US and the European Union, you get higher levels of emissions, basically, of course, because they've exported some of their pollution and some of their carbon emissions, in a sense, to the countries that are producing the goods that they're consuming, like China and India. But we need not only the USA and the European Union in the very near future, but by the time we get to the 2050s, even China and India to have zero net emissions. China is talking about that later on in the century, perhaps not as early as it needs to be. China is the world's biggest emitter of emissions. Not surprising, it has the world's greatest population. It's by no means per capita. We are much worse than China per capita in Australia. But it's a very major challenge. That's the point I want to make. And we've hardly even started. As far as Australia is concerned, this is from an ABC News report. They've obviously got this data from elsewhere. In principle, if we don't cheat on our accounting, we have promised to cut our carbon dioxide emissions in Australia by 26% from, I think it was 2005 levels. I can't remember now exactly. There's no sign of us doing this. This is a couple of years out of date, but apart to do with a previous international agreement where we made a ridiculously unambitious promise and then we're able to meet it. The government wants to take the credit from that and count it towards what we promised now. Well, nobody else in the world thinks that's reasonable. If we were actually to stick to the agreement that everybody else thought we were committing to at Paris, then that line is what ought to be the case for Australia, and this line is what was forecast before the pandemic. And there's another quote from the IPCC on the left there. Warming from anthropogenic, that means human-caused emissions from the pre-industrial period to the present, will persist for centuries to millennia and will continue to cause further long-term changes in the climate system. Here's the IPCC scenario from that same report. And basically, if you want to be confident, and this, remember, is based on negative net emissions technology being developed at scale. So they're making some optimistic assumptions here. If you want to be really confident that you're not going to go beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius from the IPCC's point of view, then our emissions globally need to decline like that blue line. Bear in mind the grey line is what's actually happened to emissions in recent decades. That's what has to happen, net emissions. The grey line on the right, which looks to having the world reach net zero by 2055, not 2040, which is what people generally talk about. Well, that's just based on them saying, if we get that negative net emissions technology, this is what would give us a 60% chance of not going beyond dangerous climate change. But even there, well, you can see why I sometimes think to myself that we're just basically screwed. It needs something very major to happen in the European Union, in the US, in other high-income countries, and probably even in places like China and India too. And someone like Will Steffen will say, I mean, some of his talks, including the TED talk I just shared with you, although that was from 10 years ago, look relatively optimistic sometimes, but sometimes people like Johan Rockström and Will Steffen and Kevin Anderson say, you know, we might already have gone across these tipping points. They don't like to be catastrophic in their predictions, but we are risking the loss of the West Antarctic ice sheet, the more frequent loss of Arctic sea ice. We are risking the loss of the Greenland ice sheet, and it won't just be the extinction of polar bears that that's responsible for, much less ice reflecting energy, reflecting heat back means the planet absorbs more heat, and there's a positive feedback effect there that could push you towards hothouse Earth. Well, actually, Will Steffen and his colleagues, this is a page from a newspaper, this is not from a scientific report, but you can look at Will's research and you can find Will Steffen talking about these 9 tipping points, some of which may already have been triggered, which then could interact with each other and could push us towards a discontinuous change in the climate later on in this century and into the next century. We've moved, Will Steffen said, he's one of the people to define the Anthropocene, from the Holocene, that's that unusually warm period since the last ice age, which has been not only warm, but also very temperate and stable, which has allowed everything which we think of as the modern history of our species and our economic development to take place. To, well, sometime, I don't know when, I can't remember when they set the date, but after 1950, we're in the Anthropocene now, where basically what we are doing is kicking ourselves out of the Holocene, not knowing what the consequences will be. How long have we got at the global level to get a handle on this? This is a picture from the Global Carbon Project, but it's quite consistent with the scientific, the IPCC and all that. If we look at global emissions and the trend, if that, here we are, the lower line here, carbon dioxide emissions, if that doesn't tip down, if we stay where we are or we even go higher, how long will it be before even the conservative scientists say we've used up our carbon budget for 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming, and beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius, we face a much more unstable, much more difficult future climate with all sorts of consequent problems from that. To be optimistic, you might keep it below 2 degrees still. If you put sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere to reflect more of the sun's rays, or you do something really geoengineering, revolutionary like that, people like Steve Keen would say, well, if we don't start cutting emissions soon, last year they were giving us 10 years left at the level of our global emissions. Well, we have cut. We've begun to cut global emissions this year, but there's no signs, as I said, of that being permanent. So when you hear people say 10 years, or a couple of years ago they were saying 12 years, this is what they mean. Our carbon budget, if we don't change what we're doing at the moment, by the end of this decade, there won't be any net emissions left for us to put into the atmosphere in order to avoid pushing ourselves, maybe if we haven't reached them already, to the climate tipping points. Maybe not. Maybe you need 2 degrees of warming than that. Maybe 2.5 degrees. We don't know. So here you are, excuse the bad language, but you'll remember that climate change isn't real rhetoric. We've had that much more in Australia than most other places, actually. Climate change is crap. That's what Tony Abbott, on one famous occasion, said. Very, very few people say that anymore. I don't think even Pauline Hanson says that anymore. You still see people say climate change is real, we're just not convinced it's caused by humans. I think that's disappearing now as well. We're in the oops stage, apart from economists like William Nordhaus, who will tell us, watch the Steve Keen interview, who'll tell us based on the idea that, based on silly things like what's the difference between the GDP per capita of Britain and Spain, given that Spain's warmer than Britain, and then let's extend that to the whole world, not taking into account how the complex system, which is our global climate, actually operates. I had somebody tell me this on Twitter the other day, talking about climate change. He said, I live in California. It sometimes gets up to nearly 50 degrees Celsius here. We seem to do okay. I mean, that's forgetting the fact that they've had terrible wildfires in California this year, of course. I got back to him, as Steve Keen said to William Nordhaus, you are confusing the weather in one place with the global climate system. Not the same at all. At some point, let's make a forecast now. You can come back to me on this because this isn't very far in the future. I would say maybe in 4 to 5 years' time, we're going to all be in that yellow zone. That's where we'll be. And I'm optimistic then that even if we have conservative governments in place, because in the end, this is not a left-right issue, it's a scientific issue, there are going to be very major changes made. And in countries like Australia, they'll rapidly escalate the investment that's already taking place in renewables. Anyway, I've gone too far now, so we'll, because it's, have I? No, I haven't. I've got 10 minutes left. Sorry, I'm misreading the watch. Thank goodness. Okay, we can go a little bit further. So how long have we got at the global level? No time at all. No time at all. How much progress have we made so far? None, really. What do we want to do something about it? There's a great movie called 2040, which I recommend you to track down and watch, which we showed at a conference in Adelaide in January. If you listen to Will Stephan, he'll say, well, join in whatever you can. And that's what I'd say too. Inform yourself like I'm trying to inform myself. Don't be alarmist about it. Don't be defeatist about it. People like Mark Diesendorf at the University of New South Wales tell us we've got, for example, if we want to go for zero net emissions in Australia in the early 2030s, we already have the technology to make that possible. So we could do it here as a country, and we could do it given the right political leadership in the most powerful countries. We could globally be heading for net emissions before 2055, maybe even by 2040, if we really wanted to, if we were going to be cautious about this. We are already rapidly increasing our investment in renewables, but I mean, the bad news is that Australia, as far as electricity is concerned, it's up to, well, maybe 25% renewable power now. Sorry, for electricity, but less than half of our primary power in Australia still is electricity. So when you look at our overall power use, then actually, you know, it's much less than that. I don't know what it is now because it has been rising, but maybe 10% of our power system at the moment is renewables. We need it to be nearly 100% quite quickly. We need to eliminate the use of fossil fuels as quickly as possible. As soon as it's technologically possible to do this, and some people say it's technologically possible to do this virtually already, although there are issues to do with the production of steel and one or two things like that. We need to leave the coal in the ground. We need to stop exporting coal. That means you need a Green New Deal or a just transition. You need to compensate people or offer people a future who are currently involved in the coal industry or coal communities. You can't just abandon them. You can't put the costs of transition on their shoulders. The same thing is true for oil. You know, I'm a complete, you call me a hypocrite. I drive around, I've still got a petrol-driven car. I'm not going to chuck it away until it's 15 years old, until it stops working. But we need to be, well, we might need to be moving towards less private ownership of cars in general, because lifestyles might have to change. But we certainly need to be moving towards electric powered vehicles, and more generally, we need to be moving our power system towards electricity, and that electricity must not be from those coal-fired power stations. And this is a bit controversial, but I don't think any further gas projects should be authorized, particularly when you take fugitive emissions into account, from what I read. Carbon emissions trading can play a part, and indeed, as I was saying, the carbon emissions in Australia were falling when we had an emissions trading scheme in place. But a market-based approach like that, although it's effective, it's not going to get you all the way there, and it's not going to get you there quickly enough. I personally think, I'm not going to say we need to completely renationalize our electricity system, but I think that it's going to come down to the government directly investing in solar power, wind power, not leaving it all to private investors. I don't think we'll do it quickly enough. We need to be investing heavily in green hydrogen and other green technologies. We need an immense research effort in those areas. We should be a global renewable energy superpower. Hydrogen might be the biggest part of the baseload power issue with renewables, if we're not going to be able to get there by batteries alone. We should by now, many years ago, have built fast rail, at least between Sydney and Melbourne, one of the world's most busiest airline routes. If you had fast trains, people wouldn't go on the planes, they wouldn't need to. There's lots of other things, of course. I'm not going to list them all now. We need to move to, yes, sustainable agricultural practices. It would help if we all became vegetarians. I'm not a vegetarian. I don't eat much meat, but I'm not a vegetarian. But we don't need to do that for agricultural practices to be much more sustainable than they are at the moment. You can look that up for yourself, and there's a reference to that on a future slide, as there is, and as there's a lot about this in Kate Rower's work, a repair and recycle ecosystem. The longer we leave it to do things like tighten up on standards for construction and for manufacturing so that things last longer and do less damage to the environment, and so that products and parts for products are more standardized and easier to recycle, the more it will be possible for us to have something like our current lifestyle. The longer we leave it, the more radical lifestyle changes may be. So I don't know, you can call it a just transition or a a Green New Deal, not just nationally, but globally. And I think as part of this, a job guarantee ought to play a role, but you might not agree with that. We're going to come back to that. We're going to talk briefly about a Green New Deal in our last course. There are some things to be optimistic about. As I've said, the market can and will play a role around the world. And there's a news story I've just shared at the bottom of this slide. It's not at the moment on our site, but I'll put this set of slides back on the site again so you can take a look at it later on. Fossil fuel companies are struggling to remain profitable, whereas the money and financial markets are moving towards renewable power. Of course they are. That's where our future's got to be, if we're going to have a future at all. People talk about how great Australia's doing as far as renewables are concerned. So I just thought I'd share this chart with you. Renewable power, as far as electricity is concerned, we've got up to about 25%. Well, we are rapidly transitioning towards renewables. And in South Australia, we're above 50% renewables now, I believe. And our Liberal government is committing to aim for net 100% renewable energy in South Australia by 2030, which is absolutely marvellous. But there are other countries that have gone further than us, the dark blue countries here. Even so, we should have gone much further, really. We are almost uniquely placed globally to be a renewable energy superpower. We shouldn't be talking about 100% renewables either, which we're going to get to in South Australia. They've already got to in the ACT and in Tasmania. There are people who say we ought to have 700 or 800% renewables. What do they mean by that? Well, with things like green hydrogen, you can perhaps export renewable power. And if that's too difficult to do, you can bring manufacturing back onshore. We can, in the future, when labour costs are not so important, we can be making things locally, perhaps even for export, which at the moment we import from elsewhere in the world, because we are very well positioned to produce steel, for example, using green hydrogen in the future, which has itself been produced or created using renewable energy. Well, here's a chart from Kate Raworth's book, Regenerative Agriculture. I don't know all about that, but you know, it's about keeping carbon locked up in the soil and locking up more carbon in the soil over time. It's about regenerating biological nutrients. And at the same time, you can't buy Fairphones in Australia at the moment, but there is a mobile phone called a Fairphone, which I think is produced by a Dutch company that you can buy if you're in Europe, where the elements within it are replaceable and recyclable. So if your battery runs out, you just take the battery out and put another battery into the phone. Kate talks about more than this, though, when she talks about restoring what she calls technical nutrients, moving towards a circular economy rather than a throwaway economy. What's our economy at the moment? Still largely, we take nutrients out of the soil, we take stuff we dig up from under the ground, we use it to make stuff, we use the stuff, we chuck it away, we create waste. We need to be moving away from this in the future in order to minimize our impact on our ecosystem. So, well, you just don't need individual companies to be buying in to the circular economy. You need, Kate Raworth says, a circular economy ecosystem. And that's the sort of thing that she's been talking about to politicians around the world. And in one or two places, like the city of Amsterdam, they're taking her seriously. Read about that in her book or on her website, or listen to her talking about that. I'm not an expert, but what we need to do, it's not just about climate change, remember, it's about all those planetary boundaries that we need to start living within. Okay, well, I might talk briefly about the genuine progress indicator. Kate Raworth, remember, talks about, I've got to go back a long way, haven't I? Talks about a panel of indicators of well-being. But if you think that politicians and the media need a single statistic to focus on, well, there are a number of candidates for single statistics which actually summarize a variety of indicators or add them all up, basically, to create one. There are a number that have been suggested down the years. There's one which is particularly associated with the work of our own Philip Lawn called the Genuine Progress Indicator. So we might talk about that briefly next time. And then I'll say a few words about a much more optimistic friend of Kate Rower called Carlotta Perez, who you might be familiar with if you've looked at the video of Carlotta and Kate talking to Mariana Mazzucato a few weeks ago. And we'll just wind this up next time. And then that'll take up a little bit of time, but I don't need the whole of next week to talk about privatization and the game of mates. So we'll finish this stuff up in our next lecture before talking briefly about privatization and then about grey corruption, which is what we're going to come on to next week. The last couple of weeks of the course, we're going to talk a little bit about a Green New Deal, but we're also going to go back to Stephanie's book once more and the deficits that she thinks about as being important. And that's basically how we're going to wrap everything up. Thank you very much. Let me just stop sharing. And let's see. Oh, a chat. Why do you think it's so low on conservative agendas? Do you know, I don't know the answer to that question because it should just be about science or anyone's for that matter. I think it's because if you think about how neoliberalism or free market neoclassical economics works, it's the idea that everything would be perfect. Well, this is not quite neoliberalism, they distort this, but the idea that everything would be perfect if everything was left to the free market. Adam Smith sometimes seemed to be talking as though God intended the world to be organized around free markets, and that was the natural way in which the world should be organized. And if only there were free markets that were competitive without monopoly power, you would have an ideal outcome. It's only during the 20th century, gradually, that economists started to talk about externalities and the idea that sometimes free market outcomes might not be ideal. But neoliberalism that took hold from the 1970s, it misused the work of Adam Smith and later generations of economists, neoclassical economists, really to construct an argument for pushing towards a more unequal society again, and one in which governments did less and took less responsibility for things. And the issue of climate change is really inconvenient if that's your view of the world, because we have a massive problem here, a bit like the pandemic in that respect, but you know, 1,000 times as important and long lasting. And we have a massive issue here, which only governments and government regulation and government investments are going to be able to do anything about in the available time. So I think it's that a little bit. But on the other hand, in other countries like the UK, there are plenty of conservative politicians that take climate change seriously. They might not act sufficiently to deal with it, but they have for years accepted that it's a problem. In Australia, well, we're going to talk about the game of mates next week. My friend Cameron Murray's book about grey corruption in this country. We're going to talk about interest group pressures. There are, of course, in a country with massive reserves of coal and gas, there is a massive amount of wealth. There are extraordinarily influential individuals and interest groups and lobbyists. There's lots of money. There's lots of well-paid jobs for ex-politicians available if you take a particular view. And that view once was that climate change is crap. Well, now you might have shifted to say, well, you know, we need to sort of do something about it, but we need to be technology neutral, and we'll be able to do something at some point to have clean coal. There is no such thing as clean coal and probably never will be. Or now they talk about gas as being a transition fuel. No, gas isn't a transition fuel. That's not what scientists say, as far as I'm aware. So I think a lot of it is grey corruption. And Hetty, you're absolutely right. The planet will be fine. It's human beings that will suffer. And the people that will suffer first will be the people who've done the least of the damage. You know, people in countries like Bangladesh that are particularly vulnerable for example, to rising sea levels, or people in the Middle East and in Africa where droughts will be more severe, and we're already seeing these problems arise. The good news is we can do something about it. Yeah, absolutely. The planet has lived through loads of mass extinctions. The planet is fine. But it would be nice if human beings could be around much longer. We don't want to have a situation, do we, where at the end of this century, there is a planet that will only support 1 billion people, when otherwise, based on current trends, we're expecting that there'd be more than 10 billion people on the planet. Because we are talking about billions of people suffering and world war. That's what we're talking about. We can do something about it. I don't want you to be negative. We can do something about it. We could do something about it now. I'm not going to tell you to do what I do, which is I support the Greens. I'm not saying they're perfect. You can be in the Liberal Party. You can be in the Labour Party. You can be in Extinction Rebellion. You can be in the Conservation Council. You can be anywhere, but you have a responsibility to inform yourself, not just to assume what is convenient, as people often do, not to put your heads in the sand. In previous generations, you might have done your degree and got your job at a bank or insurance company or something, or I don't know where. There's no reason not to work at a bank or insurance company, or I don't know where, but that's not enough. It is your responsibility, if you want to pass on a healthy planet to your children and your grandchildren, your personal responsibility. I mean, I'm talking to you as an individual, not sort of vaguely as a group, to do something about this. So the first thing you have to do is work out what this is. Don't take it from me. Go and find out for yourself. Become well informed. Don't become alarmist. The technology exists so that we can avoid dangerous climate change, or at least so that we can probably avoid dangerous climate change. But as I think it's Johan Rockstrom said, if we haven't done anything by 2030, we'll be well enough informed by then to know, A, that we haven't done anything, and B, to know what's going to happen. That's why I think sometime between now and then, we're going to move to that, close your ears if you don't like swear words, fuck moment. The sooner that we can bring this to people's attention, the better. And one last thing I'll say before we finish, how much of a mention did climate change get in the budget this week? Basically, no mention at all, nothing. Okay, that's it for today. I'm not being partisan or anything. There is no reason why a great liberal prime minister of the future and a liberal national coalition could not lead this country towards dealing with climate change. The National Party is supposed to represent farmers. After all, farmers are going to suffer. So it may be that we reach a tipping point in society and attitudes change right the way across the political spectrum. And we've got Scott Morrison, who's still Prime Minister in years to come, turning around and saying, do you know what, we've got to do something about this, and we've got to act soon. And when that happens, we should all cheer. And so I don't want to be partisan about it. It's a science issue in the end. It doesn't have to be a left-right issue. And indeed, the old communist countries in Eastern Europe used to create lots and lots and lots of pollution. They weren't by any means the environmental saints or anything. Keep it about the science, but push all the politicians to start taking action, because at the moment we aren't. That's the problem. We aren't doing anything very much, really, or anything that's beyond just sort of fig leaf. Okay, thanks very much. I think we better leave that now because we've gone way beyond time. But thank you very much for your patience. We'll finish this off and we'll talk about privatization and a few other things next week.